Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading The Warmth That Changed It All by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 1, Meeting. Weiss gently massaged her temples as rain hammered the window next to the chair she had taken occupancy of. She had been sat there for the past hour, feeling the stupid rain gradually increase the headache she had woken up with. And to make matters worse, the chair was terribly uncomfortable. Clear plastic split into two indented balls. To her, the chair was a clear indication of the company's dedication to style over substance. The only reason she could think of that her father would be interested in the company was that he had recently come under fire by the media for his questionable treatment of Faunus employees. If only they knew. "I'm incredibly sorry, Miss Schnee," the receptionist politely interrupted her thoughts. "Mr. Scarlatina has just asked me to inform you that he and your father may be another 30 minutes. Weiss sighed internally. "Thank you." Weiss smiled back with the mask she had been taught to use her whole life. "I don't suppose there is a cafe nearby, is there?" "Oh yes, just turn left outside the main entrance and take the second right," the receptionist replied with a smile. "They have the most amazing little desserts." Weiss stood and gave the woman a small nod of acknowledgement as she made her way towards the elevator. Fortunately, the elevator didn't take long to reach the main atrium, and she strode across it quickly, eager to get some fresh air. Opening her umbrella, she stepped outside and took a deep breath. While she hated the chill that rain often brought with it, the smell of petrichor had always been calming to her. With a genuine smile on her face, she set off towards the cafe. With her naturally brisk pace, it didn't take her long to reach the cafe and step inside. Warm, cinnamon-scented air greeted her to remove the chill that had begun to settle in. She poked her umbrella outside and shook off as much of the rain as she could before turning to look at her new waiting area. They were not too busy, but her first impressions of the place were very good. If Weiss was to guess, tea seemed to be the main theme for the place. Light brown, with tile floors stretched across the whole cafe and led into cream walls that held paintings of forests. She recognized some of them as Forever Fall and some as the Emerald Forest. One was a beautifully hand-drawn picture of a copse of Atlas pines, but the others were unknown to her. She looked at each painting until her gaze fell upon the counter made of dark brown wood. As she walked towards it, she took in the rest of the store. It seemed to be split into two parts. One side was comprised of circular tables of the same dark brown wood the counter was made of, and to each table there were three comfortable-looking plush chairs colored dark green. The other side of the store, in contrast, held a massive bookcase that matched the rest of the decor, filled with books. The same plush chairs were present here as well, but in this area each one had a small table next to them. Against one of the walls was one long, slightly scratched-up couch that looked more like something that would be more at home in a family sitting room. Well, a normal family sitting room at least. Overall, the effect was rather pleasant. Feeling that this place would perfectly suit her needs, she walked up to the counter. No one seemed to be present at the moment due to there being a lack of customers, so she took the time to look over the food selection they had and saw that while they had a lot of pre-prepared sandwiches, they also made fresh ones for order too. She also took a moment to look at their cakes, but seeing how she had never had much of a sweet tooth, most of them didn't appeal to her. However, there was a lemon snow cake that didn't look too sweet that caught her eye. She had just finished deciding whether to indulge herself a little or not when she saw a door behind the counter open up, and a raven-haired girl that looked to be her age step out. The girl was slightly taller than herself, though Weiss was wearing heeled shoes, so they were more eye level than they usually would be. The girl's hair was pitch black, and a pair of cat ears stuck out from the locks. Her uniform was a plain light brown button-up shirt that held a name badge to read Blake with black pants. The girl's eyes, however, were striking. Bright amber and rather unnerving, they seemed to be squinting at her as she made her way closer to the counter. "Can I help you?" the girl asked, her tone tinged with hesitancy and suspicion. "Yes." Weiss smiled pleasantly despite knowing exactly why the girl was looking at her that way. "Can I get a latte, a chicken salad sandwich, and a slice of that snow cake, please?" "Sure thing." Blake nodded slowly and began to enter the order into the register, one eye constantly flicking in her direction. "Is that fresh or from the fridge?" "Fresh, please," Weiss replied. "Of course, ma'am." The girl finished entering the order and reached over to hit her fist on the door she had just come through. After a couple of seconds, The door opened and Weiss felt her breath catch as an incredibly beautiful girl with wild blonde hair and lilac eyes stuck her head out. "Sup?" the blonde asked and looked around quickly. Her eyes widened as they fell on Weiss, and her head snapped back to Blake. "Is that chicken salad sandwich?" Blake cut her off. "But that's Yang, not now," the girl said sternly, her cat ears flattening. "Fine, fine," the blonde girl replied. "One chicken salad sandwich coming up, hackles." Weiss heard Blake tut as she turned around. "That will be 9.50 lean, please," the girl said. Weiss pulled her card from her purse and pressed it against the reader to pay. "Thank you. We'll bring it over for you," Blake replied and handed over the receipt. With a small nod of her head, Weiss took it and made her way over to the side, with the bookcase as it was less occupied. She ran her hand over the books, reading the titles on each of their spines until finally she found one that caught her interest. Bringing her hand up to the top end of the book, she tipped it towards herself until she could get the book out of the overstuffed area of the shelf. With her book in hand, she sat in one of the plush, green chairs and began to read while waiting for her lunch to arrive. "Good read?" she heard from in front of her a few minutes later. "That's one of my friend's favorites." Weiss looked up to see the blonde-haired girl from earlier standing before her holding a tray. Up close and more than just a head, the girl was even more beautiful than she had earlier thought. Her wild blonde hair reached all the way down the girl's back, allowing the observer's eye to take in the girl's body at the same time, which from what she could tell was near flawless. Even Weiss, who was very happy with how she looked, couldn't help but be a little jealous. She was tall, and every inch of the girl that she could see looked to be powerful, lean muscle. Her chest was generous enough that her work shirt seemed to be struggling to hold it. The open button that revealed some cleavage was enough for Weiss to assume the girl had chosen a shirt that was a size too small on purpose. "Gotta admit, never thought I'd see a shni in here," the girl said as she placed the tray down on the small table beside her. "I can leave if I am unwelcome," Weiss replied. "Nah, it's fine," the girl replied with a chuckle. "Just unexpected is all, especially after everything with your father." "I am not my father," Weiss replied shortly. In the 2 weeks since the new controversy had hit the news, she had become increasingly frustrated at being held responsible for his actions. "Sorry," the girl replied, her face falling. "That was rude of me. I have a habit of putting my foot in my mouth." "Clearly," Weiss replied, though for some reason the sight of the girl's downcast face abetted her annoyance. "Anyways," the girl shifted uncomfortably, "I'll leave you to your lunch." Weiss watched as the girl began to walk away only for her to stop and turn back. "Oh, by the way, there's a 5 lean fee if anything is spilt on the books, so please be careful," she said carefully. "Especially with that one, Blake will riot if anything happens to it." "I will be sure to take the utmost care then," Weiss replied with a small smile. "Great." The girl was walking slowly backwards now. "If there's any problems with anything, just ask for Yang. That's me." "I'll keep that in mind, thank you." Weiss felt her eyebrow raise and her lips form a smile as she watched the girl stumble due to her leg bumping into the side of one of the chairs. "Great," Yang repeated and made her way back to the counter. Weiss could have sworn she saw Blake give the girl a small shake of her head. With a genuine smile on her face after the encounter, Weiss settled back into her chair with her book and slowly ate her lunch. She knew the coffee would only aggravate her headache later, but for the moment she very much needed the extra boost. The food was better than she expected it to be. The quantity of everything on the sandwich seemed to have the perfect ratio, and the quality was great as well. It was also big enough that Weiss was barely able to finish it. The cake had a nice texture to it, as well, and ended her meal nicely. Though she had no real experience to judge from, it was moist and full of flavor without being overwhelming, so Weiss was more than satisfied. It wasn't long after finishing everything that she received a message from her father, ordering her to make her way back to Scarlatina Design. She groaned in frustration at being summoned, but she knew she couldn't keep the man waiting, as she didn't want to risk causing him any annoyance, especially today. She took note of her page in the book and cleared up her things to take them to the counter. Both Blake and Yang were there this time, talking about something that she couldn't quite make out, but the blonde girl was wearing a smile that could brighten up any room. Blake noticed her approach and walked up to the counter to accept the tray. "Was everything okay?" she asked cautiously. "Perfect, thank you," Weiss replied. What time do you open tomorrow? I may stop by for my morning coffee too, if that's okay? Weiss made a point to meet the fondest girl's eyes as she spoke so as to make it very clear that it was a question she would respect the answer to. We open at 6 a.m. Blake smiled back with a slight nod after a moment. Thank you. Weiss smiled back and turned to leave but stopped. With a small smile on her face, Weiss turned around and spoke mainly to Yang. I'm Weiss, by the way. It was a pleasure to meet you both. The smile that spread across Yang's face was reward enough, and with one last smile of her own, Weiss turned and left the cafe. Cold wind whipped across her face as she stepped on the street, her umbrella bending slightly from the wind that seemed to be hammering down with renewed vigor. On her way back to Scarlatina Design, the image of the blonde girl's smile forced its way back into her mind and refused to leave. Wide and toothy, it had seemed to have made the girl's eyes shine intensely, and much like the headlight of a truck in the dead of night, the image was now burned into her mind. Lost in pleasant thoughts, she barely registered that she had arrived at her destination. You sure took your time, she heard her father say in his usual droning tone. Growing up hearing it, she had become convinced that he did it on purpose in an attempt to make his client fall asleep and not know what they were signing. A thought backed by the knowledge that her father was not beyond using such devious technique to get ahead. Sorry, father, she replied with an incline of her head as she had been taught. A white car with blue trim and the Schnee Company logo plastered on the side pulled up to the sidewalk, and a driver stepped out to move quickly around the car to open the door for them. The embarrassment of having to ask the staff of such a business where my own daughter had wandered off to when I had ordered you to remain in the waiting room, he sneered. I was hungry, Weiss replied. Even though it was the truth, she couldn't help but feel like a child as those words left her mouth. She received a hard glare in return. Schnees do not make excuses, Weiss, he growled as he leant forward. You are my daughter, and you will do as I say. Do you understand? Weiss felt a shiver run through her body as her father's cold, blue eyes locked onto her. Eyes that she had unfortunately inherited. Yes, father, Weiss nodded. Good. He squinted and moved back to a proper sitting position and addressed the driver. Take us back to Schnee Tower. They spent the journey back to her father's office in silence, as usual, and Weiss mentally chastised herself for having once again buckled under her father's gaze. It wasn't until she let out an imperceptible sigh and the scent of coffee hit her nose that she remembered the pleasant afternoon she had had. That memory somehow found its way back to the smile Yang had given her. It was also the thought that she may be able to see it again tomorrow that finally managed to pull her from her self-destructive thoughts. For the first time in many years, Weiss had something to look forward to. Chapter 2, Morning Coffee. Weiss Schnee. The gentle buzzing of the alarm clock on her bedside table woke Weiss from her peaceful sleep. She had been having the most wonderful dream, but as she rubbed her eyes, the exact contents were quickly fading. She remembered her sister, Winter, was present, and there was a faint memory of purple flashes, but even those were getting murkier with each passing second. Reluctantly, Weiss pulled herself from the comfort of the warm bed and turned off the alarm. After stretching the sleep from her muscles, she walked over to her full-length mirror. She had begun to stand in front of it every morning 2 years ago, and every time, her attention was drawn to the same feature, a scar that ran down over her left eye. While it had faded rather well over the years, the sight of it was no less painful. The memory of the day she acquired it was one of her worst, and was something she preferred not to think about outside of her darkest nightmares. Yet every morning she looked in the mirror, hoping that her eyes would find something else to focus on, but they never did. With a sigh, she pulled her gaze from the scar to a pale blue card that was stuck to the side of the mirror, jammed between the glass and the white oak wood. On the front was a large number 18 surrounded by white snowflakes. Something glittered in such a way that they gave the illusion of falling even though they were stationary. With a sad smile to herself, she pulled the card from its place and opened it to read the message inside. My dearest sister Weiss, unfortunately, I was unable to secure leave from General Ironwood at this time to attend your birthday. However, he has assured me that he will organize to have my leave date brought forward as a reward for my service, so it will not be long before we see each other next. Nevertheless, 18 is a huge year for any young woman, and I have enclosed a present. I am aware it is not much, but I hope that you will find cause to wear it one day. I would also like to use this as a chance to give you some advice for the coming year. I have been in the position you are about to find yourself in, so I can say with certainty that it is not a pleasant place to be, and was the main reason I left to find my own path. I would like to ask you to follow my example also, and take some time to figure out who you are apart from our father and away from the family company. Your loving sister, Winter. P.S. I have addressed the parcel decline, so as to know it will reach only your hands. I would rather not risk father giving you a headache on your birthday complaining about me, as he usually does. Weiss finished reading the card and placed it back in its position on her mirror. It had only been a week since her birthday, yet the card was already one of her most treasured possessions because it was proof. Proof that she had at least some family that actually cared about her. A soft knock on her bedroom door snapped Weiss from her thoughts, so she turned away from the mirror to greet the knocker. "You may enter," she said firmly. The door slowly creaked open, and Weiss breathed a sigh of relief as a short, plump man with almost no hair and a thick mustache bowed his way into the room. "My apologies for the interruption, Miss Schnee," Klein spoke as he bowed his head. "The car you requested will be arriving in 30 minutes. "Thank you, Klein," Weiss smiled. "I will be down shortly." With another bow of the head, he left the room and shut the door behind him. After taking one final look at the mirror, Weiss made her way to the bathroom to take a shower. Asterisk. Weiss stepped out of the vehicle and looked around. The day was once again quite windy, but thankfully the wind had decided to leave the rain behind. She pulled the collar of her white, double-button jacket tighter around her neck and walked towards the coffee shop. Ever since her father's scandal, reporters had been far more persistent, as if they weren't persistent enough already. Whereas before there were usually only one or two sniffing around, now they had taken to camping in their vans outside the Schnee mansion. That meant Weiss had to have been much more careful with planning her route. On any non-scandalous week, Weiss guessed the journey to the coffee shop would have only taken 15 minutes, but it had taken them 30 minutes just to lose the press, and 10 more for her driver to drop her off a block away. She had looked up a map of the area last night, and fortunately alleyways ran through all the blocks nearby, so she was able to walk in relative privacy. Less than a minute later, she stepped out of the alleyway and gave herself a once-over in the reflection of a neighboring store's window. Satisfied that she looked pretty good, despite her hair being rather windswept, she walked the remaining few feet and entered the coffee shop. The smell of coffee greeted Weiss, different to yesterday's cinnamon, but equally as pleasant to her. There was also a lot more noise. The shop was understandably quite a bit busier than she had encountered it yesterday. She immediately felt herself tense slightly at the crowd. Thankfully, everybody was either too busy in conversation and enjoying their breakfast to pay her any attention. Putting a smile on her face, Weiss approached the bent-over figure she could just make out behind the counter. 2 ears perked up as she reached the counter, and a woman in her mid-40s stood up. What looked to be a knowing grin spread across her face as her eyes fell on Weiss. This woman was very clearly Blake's mother. While she was a little shorter and had larger ears, everything else looked exactly like the girl she had met yesterday. They both had the same sharp facial features, and though this woman's hair was cut shorter, it was the same pitch black as her daughter's. Her eyes were the same striking amber as her daughter's also, but the woman seemed to lack some of the hardness she had seen in Blake's. Instead, they were full of warmth and kindness. "Sorry, dear, please excuse me," she said with a smile, and stuck her head through the open door behind her. "Young dear, would you mind serving the counter for a moment?" "Sure, Callie." Weiss heard the voice, and tried her best to suppress the grin that was threatening to push its way onto her face. She was relatively successful, until she saw the blonde-haired girl emerge from the doorway and stop at the sight of her, a smile quickly taking place on her face as she stepped towards the register. "So," Yang dragged out, "you've actually come back then?" "I have," Weiss smiled. "The sandwich yesterday was really good, and I wanted to see if it would be today as well." She had totally not spent an hour last night in front of the mirror coming up with such a simple line. Fortunately, Jan let out a small chuckle. "I dunno, you may have just caught me on a good day," she replied. "Well, I will just have to find out then." Weiss grinned. "Same as yesterday, and an espresso, please." "No problem," Yang said as she typed everything into the register and Weiss paid. "I'll bring it over again. I made sure Blake didn't steal the book you were reading yesterday." "Thank you." Weiss nodded and made her way over to the seat she had taken up residence in the day before. To her surprise, she found that the book she had been reading had already been placed on the small table beside it. Smiling to herself once again, she picked it up and sat down to read while waiting for her food. "You know," Weiss heard Yang say a couple of minutes later as she placed the tray on her table, "I've known Blake my whole life, but I have never been able to understand how she can sit and read all day. I can't speak for your friend, but for me." Weiss hesitated slightly before she finished that sentence for fear of sounding stupid. "Well, they're the closest we will ever get to magic." Yang seemed taken aback by the answer, and Weiss could hear the intrigue in her next question. "How so?" "Well," Weiss began, "inside these covers is a whole different world, with whole new people and rules. When I open them and begin to read, I am no longer Weiss Schnee, heiress to the world's leading developers in technology." She tilted the book slightly to indicate it. "I'm Orwell, a simple farmer who is trying his best to provide a life for his family while fighting another soul inhabiting his body that is trying to convince him it's his job to save the world." She paused once again and hoped she was making sense. She had never really told anyone why she loved books, but that was mainly because no one had cared enough to ask. "If that's not magic, I don't know what is." Yang seemed to have been stunned into a moment of silence, but she quickly found her voice again and scratched the back of her head. "I guess I never really thought of it like that," she replied softly. "Whenever I ask Blake, she just glares at me and says it's fun." Weiss couldn't help but let out a little chuckle of her own at that one. "It is that too." She grinned and took a sip of her espresso. "What do you find fun if not reading?" "Boxing," the girl replied quickly, as if the word had been forced from her throat. "Well, anything physical really. Anything that helps me get rid of some energy." That explained the muscles, Weiss thought to herself. "Sounds exhausting." "Sometimes, but that's kind of the point." Yang laughed. The sound of her laughter caused a wave of heat to flood Weiss's body. It wasn't fake, like the laughs she had become accustomed to at her family's galas and balls, but a real one. It was a genuine laugh that seemed to light up the blonde as if she was made of sunlight. "So you don't exercise at all?" she asked and sat down in a seat opposite her. "I run a little and have the occasional fencing lesson," Weiss admitted, "though the running has been rather sparse lately." "Why?" Weiss once again hesitated before answering. She wasn't used to people actually asking her questions about herself. Usually it was about her father or the company, and even then, she was often told what to say beforehand by her father. "Well, lately it's been kind of hard to go anywhere with the press following me," Weiss sighed. "Having a camera shoved in your face, and being asked about your father's newest controversy, while you're sweaty isn't very stress-relieving." As soon as the words left her mouth, Weiss worried that Yang would dismiss them as rich girl problems. "I get that." "How?" Weiss hadn't meant for the question to be so forceful, and she prepared to apologize, but Yang, still smiling, didn't seem bothered. "True, I may not understand it on your level, but I had a similar thing happen," Yang chuckled. "I wasn't too popular back in high school. There were some things that happened, but I had these horrible braces and pretty bad acne up my right arm. But I was a good boxer. I won some tournaments and people began to act differently. They began to be nice and stuff. They invited me to parties and to hang out. I never really took them up on their offer, but it was rather annoying to be treated like a trophy, especially by people that brushed me off like I was nothing before I won anything." Weiss was stunned. Not only because she couldn't imagine the girl before her with braces and acne, but because she was actually understanding with her problems. She tried to find some words to say, but she was at a loss. "Well, I should get back to work. I've taken up enough of your time already," Yang sighed. "I'll have Callie bring over a slice of that cake on the house." "That nut." Weiss began to object, but stopped upon seeing Yang shake her head. "Thank you." Yang gave her one last smile and began to walk away. "Yang," Weiss called after her. The girl stopped and turned to face her. "Thank you for listening." Yang replied with a simple smile and a nod of her head and walked back to the counter. Weiss spent the next 20 minutes alone peacefully reading and eating the food that was just as good as yesterday's. However, while the book was interesting and enjoyable, she couldn't help but think over the conversation she had just had with Yang. It had been quite some time since she had talked to someone like that. Usually it would be winter, but since her enrollment in the military 7 years ago, those conversations had been fewer and far in between. She didn't hold it against Winter, of course. Weiss understood that she was a busy woman after all, but there were times where she really needed someone to talk to. Once she had finished her food and a good portion of her book, Weiss checked the time and was shocked to find that it was almost 8:30 and her father would be wanting her home so that he could drag her to yet another business meeting. With a sigh, she texted the driver that she was ready and picked up her plate to bring it back to the counter. She was about to leave when she heard Young practically shout from behind her. "Weiss, wait!" she called while she walked hurriedly around the counter and held out a piece of paper. "What is this?" she asked, slightly confused as she took the paper. "My number." Weiss felt her mouth open slightly as she read the number scrawled hastily on the piece of paper. "You know, in case you ever want to talk," she smiled. The girl seemed nervous as she was shifting on the balls of her feet. "Thank you," Weiss breathed, trying her very best to not let the huge smirk force its way onto her face. "I will keep it in mind if I ever need to talk." "Great," Young grinned happily. "And for the record, I really hope you use it. I enjoy talking to you." Weiss was just able to make out a small blush that had crept into Yang's cheeks, and was unable to formulate an adequate response. Instead, she settled for a nod of the head. The girl seemed satisfied with this, and quickly made her way back to the counter. It was with a happy grin of her own that Weiss exited the shop, clutching the slip of paper holding Yang's number, and got into the car knowing that no matter what her father had planned for her that day, at least something good had happened. Chapter 3. Worry. Weiss Schnee. Tap. 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 12 times. 12 times she had typed out the message, and every time she had deleted it in frustration. How hard can it be to write out a simple hello? Weiss thought to herself. With a sigh, she once again threw her scroll onto her bed and turned her back to it. It had been 4 days since Yang had given Weiss her number, and every day she wrote out messages only to delete them. She had never encountered this kind of nervousness before. Nervousness? Sure. Every time she was called to her father's study, she was nervous. But this was something else. Being called to her father's office was tiring to say the least, but the knot that tightened in her stomach each time she tried to press send was nauseating. In the privacy of her room, she let out a frustrated groan as she checked the clock to see that it was almost time for dinner. She washed her hands and made her way to the dining room. To some, a 22-rooms mansion would be considered far too much space, but to Jacques Schnee, it was necessary. The first floor rooms were almost entirely dedicated to different types of sitting rooms and entertainment. While Weiss had spent very little time downstairs in the past year, growing up she had memorized the layout. To the left you would find the music area. 3 rooms each dedicated to their own types of instrument. 1 for string, 1 for wind, and 1 entirely dedicated to a piano. That room was both her favorite and most hated, each for the same reason. To the right was more general entertainment and staff areas. The kitchen, the dining room, small bar with a pool table that was rarely used, a library, a personal movie theater, and even an indoor pool that matched their outside one. Between each of those rooms was a large sitting room, with only one of them actually having a television. Her father's belief was that there should always be a place to discuss business nearby. The upstairs was mainly bedrooms, with only a few sitting rooms, as it was rarely ever frequented by visitors. Weiss and her siblings took the left side, while their parents took the right, with a few to spare for visitors. In the very center of it all was a massive atrium that held a pair of 15-feet statues of heavily armored knights. These were placed very specifically next to each side of the stairs, because at the back of each side of the stairs was a door that led to a small T-shaped hallway. At the end was her father's study. While it was connected to the main house, it had been built separately. The study was far colder than any other room in the house, which was an accomplishment in itself, and was something she felt her father had done on purpose. It was also not a coincidence that many of her nightmares were set in that room. As she quickly approached the dining room, Weiss straightened her back and took a deep breath. Letting it out, she turned the corner and saw that her mother and brother were already sitting at the table. "Evening, Mother," Weiss said politely as she sat down. Her mother merely gave an acknowledging nod and began to pour herself a glass of white wine. Clearly not the first from how empty the bottle was. "Hello, sister," her brother said politely. "Whitley." She was not in the mood to deal with him today. The boy was a miniature of their father in every way. Vile, cruel and uncaring. But to make it worse, he had even recently began to adopt the man's talent for feigning innocence as a way to endear himself to others. "Is father running late again?" Weiss questioned her mother. "Your father is working late and will not be joining us," her mother said with no emotion. Relief flooded Weiss, and she allowed her posture to soften slightly. While not an uncommon occurrence, her father missing dinner always made her happy, as it was a night free of criticism and snide remarks, normally. "It's such a shame that father must be forced to spend so many hours at the office correcting the mistakes of others," Whitley sighed. "However, it is good to see you out of your room for once, sister." "I have been busy," Weiss replied dismissively, as she accepted a plate of food from one of the family's many butlers. "Too busy to spend time with family?" Weiss did not bother to reply and simply began to eat her food. It would not be a fun night if Whitley tattled to their father when he returned from the office. "Whitley, be quiet and leave your sister alone," her mother, Willow, interrupted as she poured herself yet another glass of wine. Weiss was certain she saw Whitley's eyes narrowed into a glare for a moment, but he corrected it immediately. "Yes, mother," he said in a low voice that gave away his annoyance. "So how has college been, Weiss?" Her mother started to Weiss' surprise. "Is your music teacher up to standard?" Her surprise quickly faded, however, as the woman finished her question. "I stopped the music course last year, mother," Weiss sighed. "I have told you so multiple times." "Oh, I must have missed it." The woman's face dropped slightly as she took another sip of her wine. "It's been very busy." "I know, mother." Thankfully, dinner passed with very little conversation from that point on, as her mother had clearly lost the desire to continue the conversation. Instead, Weiss spent the meal mentally chastising herself for once again getting her hopes up that her mother had remembered their earlier conversations. "May I be excused?" Weiss asked, even though she had only cleared half her plate. "I had a late lunch." Her mother simply gave a wave of her hand and continued to sip her wine. "Thank you." Weiss stood from the table and walked from the room. No matter how much she wished it didn't, the state of her mother saddened her greatly. Even more so when she remembered all the treasured childhood memories she had with her. However, tonight was not the night to deal with those again. Sighing to herself, she returned to her room to grab her scroll and coursework binder before making her way down to the library. Hopefully, taking her mind off of things by studying would actually help her work up the courage to text Yang. Asterisk. Yang Xiaolong. Yadong. Yang rolled her eyes and smiled as she heard her sister whine it again. "Sup, Rubes? I'm bored. Stop staring at your scroll and play a game with me," the red-haired girl replied and poked her in the side with her foot. Yang quickly seized it and began to tickle the underneath. The girl immediately began to laugh loudly and writhe around as she tried her best to pull her foot free. "Yeah. Yang." The girl breathed heavily between laughs. "Sto. Stop. Are you gonna poke me with it again?" Yang asked as she stopped the tickling. Ruby shook her head and scurried back to the other side of the couch once Yang released her foot and stuck out her tongue. Yang couldn't help but feel her spirits lift. Her sister Ruby had a gift for cheering people up. It had been very helpful lately to Yang lately, as she had hoped Weiss would have messaged already. "Maybe I misread things?" she thought to herself. "All right, Rubes, I can kick your butt for a bit," Yang replied and pulled up the controller application on her scroll. Ruby let out a small cheer as she jumped off the couch to turn on the television and load up the game. The two of them played a fighting game, the usual go-to, for an hour as they waited for their father to come home. Even though Yang easily won a majority of the fights, it was more than enough to distract her from her scroll. In fact, she was so distracted by her sister's high-pitched squeals and bouncing that she was surprised to see a new message when she looked at it next. However, for the first time in her life, she was disappointed to see it was from Blake. "Son had to work again. On my way over." The timestamp showed that the message had come in 17 minutes ago, which meant Blake would be arriving shortly. "Hey sis, Blake's on her way," Yang shouted to her sister, who had gone to the kitchen to get a snack. "Oh, think she'll help me with my history homework?" Ruby mumbled with a cookie hanging out of her mouth. "Isn't that what she normally does?" Yang replied. "And don't eat too much, Dad's doing burgers tonight, remember." "I know, but cookies," Ruby whined. Yang responded by simply throwing one of the couch cushions at Ruby only for her to nimbly dodge it. You're the one who has been begging Dad for burgers all week. Yeah, but cookies are better. Cookies are not food, Ruby. Yang scolded her. Mean it. Ruby pouted and threw a cookie at Yang. Yang prepared to launch off the couch and wrestle the girl to the floor, but Ruby was spared by a loud knock on the door. A second later it opened and Blake walked in soaked with rainwater. Hey Blake, raining. Cats and dogs? Blake interrupted and accepted the towel Ruby had quickly pulled from a nearby closet. You need new material. PSSH. Yang replied. My material is fine, you're just a sour puss. More cat puns. Blake deadpanned. Yay. Sup with you? Well, I was supposed to be spending the night at the movies with Son, but instead I'm here listening to dumb cat puns. Blake scowled with her cat ear flat against her head. Sorry. Yang genuinely apologized. It's fine. Blake sighed. So what are you two doing? Playing games after I got bored because Yang wouldn't stop looking at her scroll. Ruby replied offhandedly and held out a cookie to Blake. The smile that spread across Blake's face made Yang shiver. Why still not text you, huh? Blake smirked. I'm sorry for the puns, Blake. Yang quickly apologized again. Please don't. Why's? Ruby asked in a confused voice. Yang launched off the sofa at Blake, but she easily sidestepped the tackle. Your sister's crush. Goddamn, Blake. Oh. Yang stood and looked at Blake to see a very smug look on the girl's face. Unfortunately, she barely had time to throw the girl a dirty look before Ruby began her onslaught of questions. Oh my god, who's Weiss? Does she go to your college? Does she box too? Is she pretty? Of course she's pretty if you like her, duh, Ruby. Wait, why does Blake know but I don't? Ruby finished her questions with a pout and a sad look. You are so in for all the cat puns tomorrow, Yang said to Blake only to receive a shrug in response as the raven-haired girl took a seat on the couch. Worth it, Blake snickered. Yang shook her head and turned back to her sister, who had seemed to have moved past her brief sadness and was grinning and rocking on the balls of her feet. Look, Rubes, I don't even know if she likes me yet, so please don't make a big deal of it. Yang sighed and sat down in her father's recliner. The girl nodded, but didn't lose her excitement. So does this mean you're finally over Blake? Yang's eyes shot wide open as Ruby's hand flew up to cover her mouth, her own eyes wide at the realization of what she had just said. However, before she could yell at Ruby, Blake let out a loud laugh and gave Yang a wink. Yeah, Yang, Blake said while putting on her best sultry look, a look that even Blake didn't know was extremely convincing. Are you over me yet? Why you can new? Yang stuttered and felt her face flush. Of course I knew. Blake shook her head and smiled. You were about as subtle as Piral was around John. Why didn't you say anything? You know I'm straight, Blake said matter-of-factly. There was no need to bring up things you were obviously trying to move past. Oh, Yang replied a little disheartened. Any way someone looked at it, that was clearly a rejection. Well, yes, I have moved on. It was true. Blake had been a very huge crush for 3 of her high school years, but she had always known it was one-sided, and even though she had moved on since then, the rejection still stung a little. Blake merely shrugged and dug the television remote out from under the couch and began to flip through channels. It never ceased to confuse Yang as to how Blake could find something that her, Ruby, and their father had been unable to find for nearly 2 days. Yang, she heard Ruby say softly, as the girl tugged on the arm of her shirt to get her attention. She turned to see that Ruby's eyes were filled with sadness. I'm sorry. Yang gave the girl a small smile and pulled her onto her lap to wrap her in a hug. Despite the girl being almost 16, she was still very childish in a lot of regards. It's fine, Rubes. Yang sighed and turned to Blake. So you want to stay tonight? Dad's doing burgers. Sure, Blake replied and finally settled on a show about ninjas. The show was actually rather enjoyable, despite being far too cheesy for Yang's taste, but just as it reached the halfway point, she heard her scroll ping. Thinking it may have been her dad, she pulled it close to look only to see an unknown number scrawled across her screen. Heat quickly began to spread across her body, and her face must have shown that she was nervous to open it, as Blake raised an eyebrow and gave her a simple nod of encouragement. With a sweaty hand, she unlocked her phone and opened the message. "Hello, Yang. I apologize if I am interrupting you, but I was curious as to if that offer to talk was still available. Weiss." Yang didn't even bother trying to hide the smile that spread across her face as she got up to walk to her room and typed a short message. After a couple of attempts, she finally sent one she was happy with. "Absolutely, and it's never a bother." Chapter 4. Food and Friends. Weiss Schnee. Weiss had been knelt in front of the toilet for the past 30 minutes. Vomit stung her throat as her body emptied its stomach of the very little that she had eaten the previous day. The smell of blood and smoke still lingered in her mind from the nightmare she had woken from, and she knew that her face would be streaked with tears. Once the vomiting finally stopped, Weiss flushed the toilet and looked in the mirror to find that she was right in her earlier assumption. Red puffy eyes stared back at her, and dry tears stained her pale skin. With the memory of her nightmare still fresh, she glanced at the scar over her left eye and had to suppress the gag that tried to force its way out of her. With a sigh, she reached a shaky hand out to turn on the shower before removing her nightgown and stepping in. Asterisk. College had seemed to drag on much longer than usual, and Weiss was glad to finally be out of there, a rather new feeling on her part. Usually she enjoyed the lectures and the coursework, but lately she had been unable to focus on what the professors were saying. And she knew why. A quick look at her scroll as she exited the building revealed a message waiting for her, and with a smile, she opened it. "I'm pretty sure Blake's about to snap." It had been a week since she had first messaged Yang, and while she had been nervous at first, the conversation had quickly begun to feel natural. The reply she typed out felt like the most effortless thing she had done all week. "I am surprised she has stuck with you this long. PSSHH, she loves me too much. You coming by after college?" Weiss felt her heart rate increase slightly at the knowledge that Yang wanted to see her again. "I just finished. I should be there soon." "Awesome, I'll get you our food ready." Weiss smiled to herself as she entered the car that was waiting for her and asked the driver to take her to Blake's store. It had been 2 days since she had been there, and if she was honest with herself, she had missed Yang slightly more than she expected. The girl was just so easy to be around. She never judged, a rarity in the social circles Weiss had become accustomed to. She was also always happy and never failed to crack a dumb joke that somehow managed to drag a smile from her. Thankfully, the coffee shop wasn't too far from her college, so it didn't take long for them to arrive, and for Weiss to step into the Raalm store. It was once again quite empty aside from a tall, red-headed girl that looked familiar, who was sitting holding hands with a rather scrawny, nervous-looking blonde boy. With them sat Blake, and she actually seemed happy. She had talked to her occasionally during her visits over the week, and Blake always came across as very cynical, though Yang had assured her that was only an act. So to see her laughing was rather surprising, but she had to admit that the happier look suited the girl. As Weiss approached the counter, Blake noticed her and gave a small wave as she stood up. "Hello, Weiss," she smiled as she walked behind the counter. "The usual?" "Yes, please." Weiss smiled back and gave a glance toward the red-haired girl now that she had a better angle. "Is that Pira Nikos?" "Oh yeah, she's a friend from college," Blake replied. Weiss was stunned. Pira had been the most talked about sporting personality in all of Vale for the past year. The girl was the same age as her, yet she had already broken all kinds of records, and was rumored to be participating in the Remnant Olympics, making her the youngest person to do so in 50 years. "I can introduce you if you want," Blake offered. "Oh no, I wouldn't want to intrude." Weiss shook her head. "Intrude on what?" Weiss heard a voice say from the back room as the door was pushed open to reveal Yang carrying a sandwich. She threw Weiss a wide smile as she came into view. "Weiss was asking about Pira." "Oh yeah," Yang shrugged. "Don't worry about intruding. Pira's cool. John takes a little getting used to though." "Are you sure?" "Of course." Yang smiled as she placed the plate down and walked out from behind the counter. "Keep hanging around me, and you'll meet her eventually anyway. I only come here for the coffee." Weiss joked with a smile, which earned a raised eyebrow and a false look of hurt from the girl. Yang grabbed a table near Pira's and easily picked it up. As she held it, the muscles in her arms became more pronounced, and Weiss had to turn her head to keep her mind from wandering. Unfortunately, her eyes found Blake, who smirked at her and caused Weiss to blush. "Hey guys, mind if a friend joins us?" Yang said as she placed the table next to the one the couple was sitting at. "Sure," the boy replied with a quick glance up from a piece of paper he was writing on. "Great, this is Weiss," Yang said and positioned some chairs to sit down. "Nice to meet you, Weiss," Pira said as Weiss picked up her sandwich and made her way over to the table. "Same to you," she replied. "You're the Weiss, right?" the boy said in an odd voice. A loud thump echoed as the table bumped up slightly, and the boy let out a yell of pain. "Forgive John," Yang said, and motioned for her to sit down next to her. "He's a little dense sometimes." "Hey, it's fine." Weiss smiled at the boy who was leaning down to rub his leg. "But yes, that would be me." "John Ark," he replied and turned to Yang. "And I ain't dense, right, Pira?" "Of course not," the redhead replied quickly and gave John's hand an affectionate tap. Weiss did her best to suppress a smile as she recognized a white lie when she saw one. John, however, did not and gave Yang a smug look. "Pira Nikos," Pira said and held out her free hand for Weiss to shake. "I know you are pretty famous," Weiss said as she shook the girl hand with a smile. "So are you lately." Pira laughed and motioned to a magazine on a nearby table. A picture of herself stared back at her with a bright red headline that she couldn't quite make out from this distance. "All lies, I'm sure." Weiss scowled at the magazine. "Aren't they always?" Pira nodded. "Apparently I'm going to the Olympics this year." "I take that to mean you're not then." "I was approached, but I want to focus on my studies right now." Weiss felt her respect for the girl grow enormously. It was all too common for people to jump into things head first, especially when given such an amazing opportunity, so to meet a girl who chose education was a delight. "I still think she was dumb for turning it down," Yang said mournfully. "If I'd been approached for boxing, I would have said yes in a heartbeat." "Of course you would." Blake scorned her friend as she approached with Weiss coffee and sat down. "Aren't you currently failing 2 of your classes?" "I'm passing the important ones," Yang replied with a shrug. "You never actually told me what it is you are studying," Weiss said as she realized just how little she actually knew about Yang. "I didn't." Yang tilted her head thoughtfully. "Well, cooking but mainly art." Yang pointed to the drawing of the Atlas Pines that Weiss had noticed the first time she had entered the shop. "That's yours?" "Yup, drew it about 2 years ago and Blake insisted on putting it up." Yang sighed sadly. "I can do so much better, but she won't let me take it down." "It matches the decor," Blake said flatly. "Well, I like it." Weiss smiled at Yang. "It reminds me of home." "How so?" Pira asked as she looked at a piece of paper John was writing on. "I used to live in Atlas before Vale, and we had a lot of those pines behind our house," she replied. "Me and my sister used to love getting lost in them as a kids." "Sounds like fun," John remarked while crossing out things Pira pointed at. "My sisters are a nightmare." "He's got 7. Yang whispered in her ear, the girl's breath enough to send a shiver through Weiss and almost make her completely miss what had been said. "Speaking of sisters, how is Ruby?" Pira asked. "I've been meaning to stop by and say hello." Weiss recognized the name. Yang had mentioned her sister frequently, and Weiss had noted that she seemed to love her sister quite a lot. "She's fine, still very." Yang seemed to be searching for a word that could accurately describe her sister. "Ruby." Pira seemed to understand completely as she chuckled and gave a nod. Weiss was about to ask what Yang meant by that, but Blake let out a small groan that surprised everyone at the table and made them turn around. Stood behind her was another blonde-haired boy wearing an open shirt and a pair of blue jeans cut off around the shins. A yellowtail reached out from behind him, and the tip of it was tapping against the top of Blake's head. "Hey, son," Yang laughed. "Careful, she's got a bit more cat-titted today." Blake scowled at Yang and reached up to grab the boy's tail, eliciting a small yell from him. "I will pull it off if you continue." He merely laughed and pulled his tail free. "I'm gonna make myself a drink, want one?" Weiss watched as Blake rolled her eyes and clearly tried to hold of the smile that was making the side of her lip quiver. "Sure, does anyone else want another since son is making drinks?" She smirked at him. "We've actually got to get going," Pira said and nudged John. Practice starts soon. Oh right, see you guys later, he replied. He hurriedly packed away his papers and stood up. Son, you and Neptune still on for Saturday? Son simply gave him a thumbs up as he went about making his drink. See you tomorrow. See ya. Nice meeting you, Weiss, Pira said as she passed by. We should get together sometime and share our tabloid horror stories. Absolutely, Weiss smiled. That idea actually sounded fun to her. The two of them gave their final goodbyes to Blake and Yang before they left the shop. As they left, a loud noise came from behind the counter, and Weiss turned to see Son holding some paper towels. Don't worry, it wasn't much, he said with a small chuckle that quickly faded into a worried look as he ducked out of sight. Yang shook with suppressed giggles as Blake let out a sigh and got up to help the boy. Are those two together? Weiss asked once the raven-haired girl had left the table. They seem rather incompatible. 6 months now, Yang smiled. And I thought so too at first, but Son makes her smile, so, yeah. Weiss watched as Blake motioned for Son to get out of the way only for him to try and refuse with a lot of pointing, his tail mimicking almost every movement his hand did. With a squint of her eyes, the girl pulled a cloth from a nearby cupboard and threw in at his face with a shake of her head and one of the aforementioned smiles. Amused by what she saw, Weiss looked away to see that Yang was looking at her. It suddenly dawned on her that she and Yang were now alone at the table. While the nerves had subsided a little over the last week, they were still present, and for a couple of minutes, the two of them simply sat there in silence until finally Yang broke it. So how were your classes? Surprisingly dull, Weiss sighed. Though admittedly I was distracted. Sorry, Yang said guiltily. My bad, I'm guessing. Not at all, Weiss smiled. You actually kept me awake. Oh well, I guess you're welcome. Yang grinned from relief. You having trouble sleeping or something? A little, Weiss admitted. Nothing I'm not used to though. Well, I'm usually up at really weird hours. You ever need some company, you can just text me, Yang offered. Thoughts of Yang climbing through her window in the dead of night sprang into Weiss' mind, and she spluttered on the coffee that she had just taken a sip of. Yang immediately held out a hand to grab the cup and set it on the table as Weiss cleared her windpipe. I will, Weiss said once she had succeeded. So I didn't know you had a sister? Yang said as she leant back on her seat. What does she do? Winters in the Elysian military, Weiss said proudly. Really? Yang said in disbelief. Doesn't seem very schnee. Well, she isn't very schnee, Weiss mused. Sure, she can be a little cold and harsh, but she always means well. She's always encouraged me to do my best and find my own way in life. Do you see her much? Yang asked. Not as much as I would like to, but she does her best to make sure to set aside some time when she is in Vale, Weiss answered sadly. She sounds like a good sister, Yang replied. I couldn't imagine being separated from Ruby. Pira mentioned her earlier, Weiss said, remembering her earlier curiosity. The way you two spoke, it sounded like she was ill or something? Nothing like that, Yang replied quickly and gave a small smile. Ruby's autistic. She has trouble connecting with people, but when she does, she gets rather attached. Pira's one of the people she loves. Not knowing what else to say, Weiss said the first thing that came to mind. Sounds like it's rough on her? Sometimes, Yang nodded. But she rarely lets it bother her. She likes to spend most of her time working on cars with Dad. She's a total gearhead. Well, at least you are all close, Weiss said mournfully. We are now, but we weren't always. Yang smiled. However, there was a finality to her voice that indicated she didn't want to deliberate on what she had just said. I'm guessing yours aren't? My father made sure of that. Weiss shook her head. He sounds like a prick. Weiss couldn't stop the small laugh that forced its way from her throat. She actually rather enjoyed Yang's occasional bluntness. That's one word for him. Weiss nodded. But he is my father. I guess family is different for everyone, Yang replied. Weiss gave another nod and took a sip of her coffee. So do your family support you doing art? For the most part, Yang smiled and turned her head to acknowledge a customer who had walked in. Dad was critical at first and told me to make sure I had a fall back. And you chose cooking? Weiss joked. Hey, people always need chefs. Yang laughed. Besides, my dad's family is from Mistral. He would probably disown me if I couldn't cook. So I'm guessing you can do more than just sandwiches then? Weiss teased. Absolutely, Yang said as she stood up and Blake waved for her. I'll be right back. Weiss gave the girl a nod and took a bite from her sandwich. As usual, it was fantastic, and she couldn't help but wonder what other food the girl could cook. While this wasn't served in the Schnee manner, Mistralian food was her favorite due to their spices giving it such amazing flavors. She was in thought about all the amazing food she had tried during her last visit to Mistral, and wondered if the girl would be able to make any of that when Yang sat back down. Sorry, Yang smiled as she sat down. What were we talking about? You were telling me what you could cook. Well, Mistralian food, obviously, Yang replied. Most Vale stuff is pretty easy. Adlesion? Weiss asked out of curiosity. Not my favorite to cook, but I can do some Adlesion dishes, Yang said after a few seconds of thought. You guys eat a lot of fish. Weiss had to laugh at that. That is true, she replied. Solitas isn't really a place that very livestock friendly though, too much snow. Yeah, I can see that, Yang said quietly. But you study business and finance, right? What's that like? Honestly, more fun than it sounds. Weiss nodded, surprised that Yang had remembered. It is to me at least. You enjoy lectures? For the most part, Weiss laughed. You don't? I do, Yang grinned. They're better than hot milk at making you fall asleep. You're terrible. Weiss smiled and shook her head. I agree. Weiss let out a small chuckle as she finished her coffee and looked at Yang out of the corner of her eye to find that the girl was watching her with a radiant grin that threatened to make her blush. She was about to ask Yang more questions, but her scroll began to buzz in her pocket. Her good mood instantly fell as she saw her father's name on the screen. Excuse me a moment, Weiss groaned to Yang as she stood up and walked to an empty part of the shop. With a final look at Yang, she sighed and answered the call. Hello, father. Your driver has informed me that you are still not on your way to my office, he said in a low drawl. What have I told you about punctuality, Weiss? My apologize, father, Weiss replied. I am leaving now. We will speak more on this matter once you arrive. Yes, father, she replied. The cut-off tone sounded, and she let out a sigh. How could she have forgotten about her meeting? Had she really been enjoying herself that much? Reluctantly, she made her way back to Yang and picked up her bag. I'm sorry, I must be going now, Weiss apologized to the girl. I forgot I had a meeting at my father's office, and I am running late. Oh, Yang's face fell slightly. That's fine, I should get back to work anyway. I enjoyed meeting your friends. Weiss smiled at the girl, hoping the grin she liked so much would spread itself back across the blonde's face. And talking to you. Same here, Yang replied. I can give Pira your number if you want. Weiss pulled her bag over her shoulder and made for the door. Yes, please, she replied. I will try and stop by tomorrow if I can. Awesome. The girl nodded and began to walk backwards to the counter. With a final smile at the girl, Weiss turned and pushed the door open. Hey, Weiss! Weiss halted straight away and turned to see that Yang had stopped moving backwards. Instead, she was wringing her hands in front of her like she was nervous about what she was about to say. Are you The girl paused briefly to think before finishing. Are you free on Friday? Weiss was taken aback. She had definitely noticed Yang looking at her, but to hear Yang actually try and ask her out succeeded in making her heart beat much faster. Nevertheless, Weiss tried to keep her calm appearance. I believe so. Gee, great. She nodded, and Weiss saw the girl throat bulge slightly as she swallowed nervously. Would you like to maybe do something? I could cook. Weiss took a moment to think before she replied. She wanted to say yes straight away, but she knew that accepting could create problems in the future. However, as she tried to think of all the things that could go wrong, she looked at the blonde-haired and found that she just didn't have it in her to say no. I would love to, Yang, she replied with a smile that she couldn't suppress. The grin she liked immediately spread itself across Yang's face, and the wringing of her hands stopped. Great, Yang said, her voice filled with relief as she tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. Sorry, you were in a rush. Oh, yes. Weiss shook her head as she remembered what awaited her. I will text you later. She saw Yang nod as she turned and hurriedly left the shop. Her excitement for the coming date forced a smile on her face that lasted until she approached the car and the driver opened it for her to enter. As she did, she looked the driver in the eye. What is your name again? Dudley, ma'am, he replied. With a nod, she made a mental note to make sure he was not her driver on Friday.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.